This is the School Leadership Show, the only podcast dedicated to helping practicing and aspiring school leaders improve their craft. The School Leadership Show brings together thought leaders from inside and outside of education to deliver you the insights and tools you need to succeed in school leadership. In this episode, Jen David Lang returns to the podcast, and we nerd out on the book Becoming the Math Teacher You Wish You'd Had, Ideas and Strategies for Vibrant Classrooms by Tracy Johnston Zager. This was a great conversation, and as two former math teachers, we had a blast. There's a link in the show notes to a companion website that goes along with the book that has a ton of resources. And as has become the practice, the guest, Jen, picked the intro music, and it's XTC's Burning with Optimism's Flame. So thanks, Jen, for picking that, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. So I'm here with Jen David Lang. Jen, welcome back to the podcast. Far and away the most prolific guest. Is that the right word?
I don't know. Now it is.
Now it is. We're going to go with that. So the book we're going to talk about today is Becoming the Math Teacher You Wish You'd Had, Ideas and Strategies from Vibrant Classrooms by Tracy Johnston Zager. Is that how she says it?
I'm not sure if it's Zager or Zager.
Zager. Z-A-G-E-R. Well, we'll go with that. So this book, and we were just talking about this before we started, is, I would say, dense is probably an understatement, but in a good way. That it's a 350-page book about everything that, like the title says, you wish your math teacher had done. So can you talk a little bit, maybe just in general, about how it's organized, and then maybe we'll dig into some different parts?
Sure, but for anybody who's turning off the podcast because they heard the word dense, maybe I'll revise that and say it's chock full of ideas and examples, but it is very readable. I mean, you could read it at the beach. It's very intriguing and entertaining, so don't let that word scare you.
So that's why you write the main idea, and I just ask random questions.
But anyway, no, it's a great book. Basically, Tracy has figured out that there's a big gap between how math is taught in schools and how math really occurs in the real world. She was with her mother one day, and her mother, who works in business and has lots of skills, measuring, calculating, scaling up, described herself as bad at math. And so Tracy asked her, well, what is math? And her mom said, math is when they hand you a sheet of paper and it has a word problem you don't understand on it. So I don't know. We should admit, Mike, you and I are both former math teachers. So let's come clean. We might not have had that experience. I don't know if you had that.
Nerd alert all day long. So what levels did you teach?
I was mostly middle school. That was my favorite area. How about you?
I taught fifth grade for a few years, where I taught all the subjects, but then I taught high school, and I did algebra, geometry, and trig. And geometry, and I'm definitely a minority because geometry was my favorite. I loved taking it. I loved teaching it. But I was having this argument with my 11th grade daughter last night about how geometry is great, and no, she was definitely disagreeing with me. So
she probably had the experience that Tracy describes, where she has asked teachers to describe their own experience when they were math students. And then she asked mathematicians to describe mathematics, and these words are completely different. So, if we could ask your listeners for a moment to think of what's one word to describe what your experience was like as a math student. Just take 5 seconds. And Tracy says the kinds of words that come up are memorization, stress, scary, ashamed, fear, fail, mistakes, humiliating, pointless. Those are the kinds of words that many of our teachers felt when they were math students themselves. But when she speaks with mathematicians, they describe a completely different world. They use words like passion, absorbing, game, persist, free, discovery, play, joy. So she felt like she wanted to capture what is it that real mathematicians do that is so different from the deadly stuff all of us are guilty of doing in our classrooms to our students. And she very cleverly organized her book with the 10 habits that she has seen that real mathematicians have, or they use, skills or habits. So the 10 skills, and they each are one chapter in the book. Mathematicians take risks. 1. Mathematicians make mistakes. 2. Mathematicians are precise. 3. Mathematicians rise to a challenge. Mathematicians ask questions. Mathematicians connect ideas. Mathematicians use intuition. Mathematicians use reason. Mathematicians prove. And finally, mathematicians work together and alone. So she took these 10 habits and then she brought us through classrooms.
Did she talk about how she kind of derived or synthesized those habits from the conversation she had with people who do math as adults?
Yes, okay. That's my understanding. Okay. And she distilled it into these 10 areas.
Before we go in deep into any of those, did she get into any of the why? Like, why has math instruction devolved, I guess, into the experience that those teachers described about themselves?
I think it's almost like this perpetual cycle when you've had that experience done to you as a student, where your whole understanding of math is being given a worksheet and some problems and that you often don't understand, and you're not encouraged to understand why. It's very hard to break out of that and have a different vision of what math could be. Most teachers are not hanging out with real mathematicians. Most teachers have had the experience of being a math student.
Well, and I think about my 10 years as an elementary school principal, and the vast majority of the teachers that I supervised, K through 6, became elementary school teachers, so they didn't have to take any math in college. I mean, maybe that's an overstatement, but let's say they did not end up taking any math in college because they were elementary ed majors, and so they weren't, their own content knowledge wasn't deep enough to really, I would say, show any of those habits that Tracy identifies as in the chapters.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely contributing.
So I didn't mean to take you off track. So let's get back into, let's start talking about these chapters. And don't worry, everybody. Jen and I already made a decision that we're not gonna march through every single one, even though we might like to, and that would be very math teachery of us, perhaps. But we're gonna kind of pick and choose and jump around a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think, the great thing she starts with is this whole idea that we need to introduce to our students what mathematicians actually do. Because kids, even kids as young as 6 years old, 7, first, second grade, they think the object in math is to answer the teacher's question fast, right, and easily. And those are the people who are best in math. But if you can imagine, right, a real mathematician is not sitting there, quickly answering times tables. What's 6 times 7? 42. Oh, good. I'm a good mathematician. So it's really quite the opposite. Mathematicians do the opposite. And so in the first chapter, she suggests creating a mini unit where you introduce your students to what is math. We do that in other areas when we teach science. What is science, actually? When we teach history, what is history? But we start doing the math before we even introduce the idea of what is math. So she suggests, and this is geared toward elementary, but I have to say that the ideas in the book, even though it says for K to 8, they absolutely apply to high school. And I'm sure you've made some of those connections as a former high school math teacher. But she says, first use picture books to introduce real mathematicians and what they do. And you could introduce biographies or autobiographies. But the idea that Einstein loved to just question and wonder and figure out and notice, and have kids read books about that it wasn't about answering questions correctly. And then she suggests that you bring math into the present day. And she actually has these great videos that my younger daughter had brought to me by this woman, I don't know, V Hart. She's a math musician. She does these great videos if you have a chance to Google her, where she's made over 100 videos of math with fun objects like mashed potatoes, gravy. And it's a great way to take away the idea that math is about answering 20 problems in a row. So she says, first, introduce real mathematicians through books, bring math into the present day. And then the third thing is to find math in our world. She has students go on a walk in their schools or at home and bring in something that seems mathematical. And she gives examples of a math hunt where students brought in a tube of toothpaste, a slotted pancake turner, dry macaroni, and more. And it led to a whole discussion about shapes, geometry, all different parts of math. And it's a way to open up the conversation so different kinds of math experiences to say, like, this class is going to be different.
So, okay, I want to pause there for a second. So that idea of trying to introduce kids to real mathematicians was probably one of my most epic failures as a high school teacher. So I think I was teaching it was a class of 10th graders, and I had gotten a book that each chapter was a different mathematician, and I tried to have them, read it and talk about it and see connections with what they were doing. And maybe it was just poor planning and pedagogy, but they were just, or maybe they had been so institutionalized into the fact that all that matters is doing the problems on the paper. I don't know. I blame myself, but I could imagine that if students had that in an earlier age, they would be a little bit more warm to the idea that there are people who choose to use math as part of their occupation.
Yeah, well, also, I think the way we teach math is such a separate subject,
Yep.
Like, you probably use math in your job, I use it in mine. It doesn't mean I'm a mathematician, or like Tracy's mother, she was using math. So to understand that math is sort of part of a lot of the things that we do in life, whether we're going to the grocery store or we're, budgeting for our household, there's many ways that it's a part of things, and you don't have to be Einstein to use math and appreciate math in your life.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. So now, which one what else do you want to dig into here?
I think I won't do it in order. I'm going to jump ahead because in this idea of introducing math, in her chapter where she talks about mathematicians ask questions, that's one of the 10 habits. That's chapter 7. I love what she does here because this really helps to take math in a different direction. So one example she gives is to teach kids to ask questions. Mathematicians don't answer questions that other people have asked, but they also ask their own questions. So to get kids in the habit of asking questions, if anyone runs an inquiry class, you know what that's about. So she gives a great example of taking a book and showing a photo of an Oreo cookie and a photo of a double stuffed cookie. And she says, come up with questions. What are questions that you have? And at first it's hard, right? As adults, if you have never done this, you might be like, what's the question? But if you get kids into the habit of doing this every day, bring in photos, there's some great questions. Do double stuffed Oreos really have double the stuff? How many ways do people actually eat them? Why do people want double the stuff, but not double the cookie? So there are all these great questions that you could go on, and you could do a whole science experiment where you compare the amount of stuffing in the original to the double. Is it really double? But the idea of getting kids to just ask questions is brilliant. And it doesn't, this is an example with Oreos that you wouldn't necessarily think math.
Does she get into, because right now I can imagine math teachers or people who work closely with math teachers starting to trail off and think, well, that's a waste of time. I have so much content to cover. I have to get into this. And how am I going to, how is this going to help my students prepare for the Regents exam or whatever. Does she talk at all about getting people over that inquiry hump? Because that's what it is. I mean, I know,
Yeah.
Go ahead. Anything about that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. That's a perfect segue. So in this vein of trying to get kids to ask questions, so now let me bring you to a math word problem. So you've probably had this experience, Mike. I've had this experience. You give kids a math word problem and they say, "Oh, am I supposed to multiply? Is that what I just do? Or oh no, divide. Just tell me. What operation is it?" And they're not thinking at all about the problem. They just want to be given the procedure to solve the problem, and they haven't understood it at all. So she gives a great example of how you can take a word problem, you have all the sentences, and then you just don't include the question that the word problem is asking. And you have kids come up with questions, and the questions mean they have to understand the problem. So let me give you the example in the book. So she writes, Ethan, Fran, and Gloria have summer jobs at the Dairy Freeze. They collect their own tips and then share them equally. One week, Ethan collected $25 in tips, Fran collected $48, and Gloria collected $41.
Wait, hang on. How come the boy has the lowest tips? What's going on with that?
Exactly. So then she says, now ask your kids to ask the questions. Why does Ethan have the lowest amount of tips? Did Ethan work fewer hours than the girls did? Is he grumpier? Is he a worse employee? Is he not as friendly? Is he, what's the so there's lots of questions, and you can begin to understand the problem, right? And you and I know as math teachers, the question is going to be, right, if they had to pool these tips for this week and share them equally, how much would each student get? So you're going to get to that question, but by taking away the question, kids don't jump to, wait, is this a subtraction problem? So instead, it helps them begin to understand this question. Do they just get tips? Do they also get a base salary? So I think that the idea is not to ask questions about double stuffed Oreo cookies for the sake of understanding Oreos, but to help them to think through the problem. And as you and I know, in the New York State Regents exam, it's no longer just a bunch of numbers. You have to read and understand the problem in order to solve it.
Right. And I think it's one of those things like Gusky talks about when he writes about getting teachers to sort of change their mind when it comes to a new approach to something. It's almost like they have to see that it works, and then they'll believe in it. You know what I mean? Because I think it's one of those things where everything, the current pedagogical approach across the board, or for the most part, I would say, is that sort of rote, linear, memorize the words that mean the operations and sort of translate and then solve the problem versus really trying to understand the problem at a deep level. So, yeah, I like that concrete example of getting them to think about it. And, this whole thinking, and I keep calling it inquiry, and I don't know if that's exactly what it's supposed to be called, but is very prevalent in the next generation science standards too. This idea of a phenomenon and getting kids to dig deeply into that as a way to, jumpstart their curiosity and their desire to get into the actual content.
Yeah, no, I think there's not just in science, but in history as well. There's a big inquiry movement in many different areas. And I think what you're saying about what Gusky's saying is that teachers want to see that it works. What I like about Tracy's book is that she's not saying rip up your whole math curriculum. She's giving, there are a lot of very small ideas that you could try tomorrow. Principal can go into a classroom and say, give that same word problem again, but just subtract the last line, which is the question of the problem, and have kids come up with 3 questions. You could do that very easily.
Right.
You could have 2 photos up on your smart board, of an Oreo cookie and a double stuff, and you could spend 1 minute having kids come up with 3 questions. You can just try it. It's not a whole revamping of the math curriculum or your whole pedagogical approach. It's just try this and see how it goes, both to improve the understanding and also the engagement. Right? I mean, I could barely finish reading that, and you're like, wait a minute, why is Ethan earning the least amount of money. So there's a little bit more engagement there than if I had just asked the math problem. It's not that engaging of a problem.
Well, and I would imagine and make the argument that it's like a muscle. It's like anything else, where the more you do it, and the more you kind of force kids to ask questions, and then they get a chance to explore those questions, the easier it's going to be for them to do it, and the more eager they're going to be to do it.
Yes, yes. And you see, if you follow Tracy Zager on Twitter, she's always seeing things in the real world and asking questions about them. And you can see that it's completely changed her vision. So imagine our students going to the grocery store and saying, I wonder if 3 oranges for $2 is less expensive than 4 oranges for $2.50, But yeah, it's a great habit, and I agree. It's like a muscle. The more we can get our kids to develop that muscle, the better they can approach the world with a curious, wondering, mathematical mind.
So what's the answer? Why did Ethan earn less? Just kidding.
But anyway, so we should go through a few other habits, I suppose.
For sure.
So let's take Mathematicians Rise to a Challenge, Chapter 6. So this I like also because we can tweak our current math problems to do what she's suggesting. So obviously we have to get our kids excited about a challenge. We have to say like, oh, this is something we have to do for the Regents. We can't talk like that. We have to say, oh, great. Today, we've got a really fantastic challenge for you. You're going to just love this and dive in and work hard. But then she talks about taking textbook problems and turning them into challenge problems, ones that are more open. So she describes the problem, and I know you and I have both seen this in textbooks, where there's a problem, but then it breaks down all the steps and tells you sort of what to do by putting all those steps in there. I usually call that, when I speak to math teachers, and I won't say this on a podcast, but scaffolding the SHI, what, out of a problem. That, if you just put it in too many details and you don't let the kids do their own thinking. So she gives an example of the mittens problem, where it's, this is just like first grade, very simple. It said, how many mittens would 4 children need? So that's a good problem. How many mittens would 4 children need? But instead of just leaving the problem like that, the textbook has a whole chart with number of children and number of mittens. And they've shown you 1 child needs 2 mittens. 2 children need 4 mittens. And then you go on and you fill out the next 2 columns. So the problem becomes like, fill out this chart. So one suggestion is like, just put it on a blank piece of paper. Just put the problem down and put it on a blank piece of paper. That's the easiest way to make a small change. A better way to make a problem more challenging is to open it up. So instead of, to give a very simple example, instead of giving kids a question like, what is 1 plus 9? You can open that up and say, what are all the ways that we could make sums to 10? That's a much more open and engaging and challenging problem. Instead of asking kids, what's the area of a rectangular garden that's 6 feet by 8 feet, you could ask, if we have 48 square feet, what possible dimensions could we have for a rectangular garden?
Or I think you could take it back even further. When I think about us planting our garden, like, I want to plant 6 tomato plants, and they recommend that each plant have this many square feet, and I have this much. This is how big my yard is. How big does my garden need to be? Like, I think you could even back it way up into something even more authentic.
Absolutely. And that's the idea, is that she's giving you small ideas, but they could be huge. It could be to completely rewrite the problem and make it open, or even use some resources. She gives great resources throughout the book. So one in this chapter was openmiddle.com. There are great examples of opening up problems so that there's more than one answer, so it actually raises the level of rigor. And she references a TED Talk by Dan Meyer called Math Class Needs a Makeover, and it helps you think about opening up math problems, something that all of us can do with the problems that we have in our textbooks, in our curriculum. It's not so difficult to do. So that's another That's another habit that mathematicians rise to a challenge.
Yeah, I really would have loved a little bit of that effort last night when I was trying to help the 11th grader with limits in
Mm.
pre-calc.
Uh,
Yeah, no context whatsoever. And
yeah.
anyway, my tale of woe. Okay, keep going.
No, and calculus, I mean, that's one of the most applied aspects of math, right? There should be a lot of context there. Let's see what else. We'll go through a few more. I don't want people to get too bogged down, but so mathematicians are precise. That's chapter 5. So I don't know, in a lot of grades, estimation is its own self-contained unit, and then students never use estimation other than outside of that unit. But estimation is actually a great tool to see if your answer is crazy. You know, you ever get kids who it's like, add 28 and 28, and they come up with, 5,600. You're like, does that make sense? But again, like you're saying, as a muscle, we can help our kids by doing small activities each day to strengthen their estimation so they can see if their answers are ridiculous. So each morning you could come to the board and put up an estimation problem. So estimate the answer to 6,739 divided by 47. And then you put a bunch of answers, or you solicit a bunch of answers from students and you put them up. So 130, 155, 2,600, 6,700. You put up a whole bunch of answers that students give you. And then you have everyone use the following structure to write why they think one of the answers is unreasonable. I think, you pick one of the answers, 155 is unreasonable because, and then they have to explain it. And it's just a way to get them thinking about whether their answers are reasonable. And this works whether you're teaching kindergartners or you're teaching, college level 3rd-year calculus. Is this a reasonable answer? And, going back to teachers who are worried about standardized exams, I mean, that's a great way to start, right? You're looking at a multiple choice test. Which of these questions are completely ridiculous? Oh, I know that because I've strengthened my estimation skills.
I could not agree more. I think that was always the bane of my existence, that we decoupled estimation from the rest of math. Like it was this discrete thing that has nothing to do with actually solving problems. Oh man,
Yes.
This book makes me want to go back and teach math again.
Yeah. They should have another title for teachers. It's not just the math teacher you wish you'd had, but the math teacher you wish you'd been.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, no, me too. I wrote Tracy. I said I wish I were back in the classroom. I just want to do all of these things. But so let's see, to give a few other ones. Another habit is mathematicians take risks. That's chapter 3. We unwittingly reinforce the idea that kids should not take risks and get everything right. They answer problems quickly and we say, great, good job. They answer things correctly and we say, perfect, everything is correct. So she suggests in your written feedback to encourage kids to challenge themselves a little bit and take risks. So in one classroom, the teacher asked students to write equations that result in the number 60. Not sums, but equations. So one of the star students wrote, 1 plus 59, 2 plus 58, 3 plus 57. And she did it really quickly and she turned it in. So instead of the teacher writing, these are all correct. They were correct, but there was nothing creative. There was no 61 minus 1. There was no 120 divided by 2. It was all very, very simple. So what she wrote in her feedback was, wow, you've got a lot of problems here, but is this challenging to you? ? And just by changing the way we give feedback, so she's not saying it's wrong, it is right, but the kid wasn't challenging herself. And then the next time she gave an open-ended problem like that, this kid gave many more interesting equations to get to the solution because she saw the teacher was not valuing correctness, but the teacher was valuing risk-taking.
Well, and speed, not valuing speed necessarily too. So I think that's something that's a trap we fall into. Kids, reward the getting it done quickly.
Yeah.
How does she balance that with? Does she get into fluency at all? Because I know that gets people jammed up a little bit in terms of the importance of fluency with procedure and facts.
I don't know if she specifically addresses fluency, but I think that what she's suggesting is that when you have a deeper understanding, I think the fluency can come more easily. You know,
Okay.
if you really understand what 6 times 5 is, it's not just a matter of memorizing the 30, but but through your understanding, your fluency can come. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
But yeah.
All right, I think
All
we have time for one more. So what's going to be the
one
big
more.
one,
Oh
the
my.
pièce de
Um,
résistance here?
maybe intuition. Maybe we should do
You're not going
this
to go to
intuition one.
food.
I thought that one was kind of interesting and a little
Okay.
bit different. Because there's lots of ideas in this book that math teachers will read and say, oh, yeah, I've tried that. But then she has so many new ideas. So she talks about how mathematicians use intuition, which is like a sense of the problem. And people have a very skewed idea of what intuition means. It doesn't mean like things just come to you. It's actually based on your knowledge and your experience, right? So when mathematicians have an intuition that the Empire State Building is a certain height, it's because they've thought about height and they can compare it to other buildings and they know it's not just guessing randomly. So she says that, and again, I like the word you use, muscle. She talks about having practice with intuition. We don't really think about that, but let's take your favorite subject, geometry, right, Mike? So if you want students to have some sense of angles, they have to know what 90 degrees looks like. They have to know what 45 degrees looks like. So you might give them some sample angles, like landmark angles that you would put up in the classroom or let them play with, so that when they are figuring out later if an angle is acute or if an angle is, 182 degrees, or, what is that kind of going to look like? Because you and I right now, when I say 182, you and I picture 180, a straight line. But we got that from our experience. So she suggests that we practice estimating. So she suggests this great website, estimation180.com, and this middle school math teacher, Andrew Stagel, where he puts up a whole bunch of estimation problems that you can give kids after you've introduced some baseline examples like the angles, but also just to get them thinking. And he has some examples that span non-traditional math topics. So for example, how much do you think bacon shrinks when you cook it? What a great question, right? You could put that up as a do now. Have, some kids want to go home, measure the bacon before, measure it after, and see how much does it shrink. How long do you think a song like "We Will Rock You" lasts? Well, I guess you'd have to know the song and have a sense of time. We know kids have a really poor sense of time, but if you help them begin to understand what's 1 minute, what's 2 minutes, what's a half hour, maybe they can do these kinds of estimation problems. They will randomly guess at first, but then if you give them these opportunities, they will start to use that knowledge to make informed guesses. In one class, a teacher has an empty pint, quart, gallon, liter that's empty. So the kids can literally visualize those things when they're making an estimation for how much volume something would take up.
Instead of just memorizing how many ounces in a quart.
Exactly. That's the contrast.
I could talk about this stuff all day. I think this is such a cool book, such a great approach. Becoming the Math Teacher You Wish You'd Had, Ideas and Strategies from Vibrant Classrooms by Tracy Johnston Zager. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Jen, any parting shots on this topic?
I just, if you want to take a look at my summary, because it is 350 pages, so it might be a little bit overwhelming. You're welcome to send me an email to get a copy. But you don't have to read the entire book. You could pick a few of the habits and read them and try to put them into practice. So don't let the length intimidate you. It's a very accessible, exciting book.
Perfect. And Jen, if people want to find out more about you and The Main Idea, where should we send them?
They can go to themainidea.net.
Perfect. Jen David Lang, thank you again for being the most frequent guest. We should probably just say that you co-host this podcast with me, and sometimes I do it solo.
No, you're the host. But and thank you for co-nerding out with me on the Great Math Book.
It was awesome. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.